For your unpleasure, the Hauteur-Couture of Goth. Heavily influenced by 1980s music journalism in Britain, Mark often spoke with his students at Goldsmiths about the philosophy education he received through the pages of the New Musical Express. Having been introduced to, and subsequently disappointed by, Derrida, thanks to writers such as Ian Penman and Mark Sinker, this exposure eventually led him to develop his own narrative surrounding hauntology. In 2014's Ghosts of My Life, Mark stated that the NME constituted a kind of supplementary informal education system in which theory acquired a strange, lustrous glamour. A statement which couldn't be further from the reality of today's tube station freebie magazine masquerading as that very same publication. This approach carried through in his own work, as is evident in For Your Unpleasure, the Hauteur-Couture of Goth, where Mark glides from Lacanian desire to Baudrillard's seduction and J.G. Ballard through his discussion of Siouxsie and the Banshees and Goth. Posted by Mark on K-Punk in 2005, the work plainly situates itself within a specific cultural period in the UK. This was a time when teenage Rosie Webster and her boyfriend Craig went goth on Coronation Street, when Big Brother ruled the small screen and sportswear brutalitarianism dominated the streets. In addition, there are clear links to other works selected for this publication. My chest was full of eels pushing through my usual skin is a lyric from Siouxsie and the Banshees' Cascade, featured on 1982's A Kiss in the Dream House, and was used by Mark in his mix of the same name. In going back to the introduction to Mark's PhD thesis, Flatline Constructs, we can read his discussion of Gothic materialism in relation to Spinoza, playing Baudrillard and Deleuze Guattari off against each other, with J.G. Ballard thrown into the mix. Siouxsie and the Banshees, he says in For Your Unpleasure, drew heavily from J.G. Ballard, and in doing so they took on the equivalents of the semiotic, the psychotic, the erotic, and the savage. These references keep popping up, yet Marx's points are never repetitive. Rather, For Your Unpleasure, as with all of his writing, reads like an education, weaving in discussion of desire, subordination, and female objectivity, with Siouxsie Sue's role as an idol. Quoting Baudrillard, Mark states that idols do not reproduce, but arise from the ashes, like the phoenix, or from the mirror, like the seductress. Indeed, he nods to Flatline Constructs in saying that the Gothic has always been about replication, as opposed to reproduction. Replication, in this instance, is key. It is important to note other examples of Mark's music writing. In an early example of his work, published in the New Statesman and Society in 1994, he describes Darkside as one of the latest, most interesting mutations of rave, which borrows its ontology from horror and science fiction. He fluidly links cyberpunk with Jonathan Meades, Baudrillard with Ramsey Campbell, and the decay of the British welfare state with a paganistic celebration of dark forces. Then, some 20 years later in Ghosts of My Life, Mark turns to Drake and Kanye West's so-called secret sadness and their morbid fixation on exploring the miserable hollowness at the core of super-affluent hedonism, having practically run out of products to consume. Drake and West, Mark writes, dissolutely cycle through easily available pleasures, feeling a combination of frustration, anger, and self-disgust, aware that something is missing, but unsure exactly what it is. Finally, in The Weird and the Eerie, published at the beginning of 2017, we read what is perhaps one of the last published examples of Mark's music writing. Here he returns to a familiar subject, the fall, having previously posted Memorex for the Krakens, The Fall's Pulp Modernism, in 3 parts on K-Punk in 2006-7. In this new exploration, he discusses their 1980 to 82 records Grotesque, After the Gram, and Hex Induction Hour, in relation to his concept of the weird, arguing that Mark E. Smith's relationship to the character Roman Total, whose body is covered in Cthulhu-esque tentacles, is the same relationship as that which H.P. Lovecraft had with Randolph Carter. In returning to For Your Unpleasure, we are taken back to the heyday of K-Punk, when Mark posted regularly and energetically, reaching further into the crevices of music philosophy than anyone else dared, while turning what readers thought to be music journalism on its head. Read the text, take note of the many references, then go away and read, watch, and listen to those too. Mark's music writing, just like Penman and Sinker, is a supplementary informal education, which must be taken advantage of. Ashiya, Eastwood.
I sort of lived in her room on the floor for about a month or so, and she moved out, and I had a room to myself. But it was so depressing, I sat there for about, every single night, because I didn't know anyone in Bristol. I sat there every single night with my bottle of 5 pints milk, and now and again having a couple of spoonfuls on it, reading the same book over and over again about 30 times. In the end, I got into such a Clockwork Orange. I was reading that over and over again, and in the end, I got to sort of such a state of depression that I slashed my wrists up and all that. But it seemed like a good idea. I think it was just to get attention to myself really at the time, So I thought, this is living. So I thought, right, I'm off. So I left my bed sit, sold all my belongings, and just moved into a squat. And ever since then, I've just been squatting around with them a lot. And then Meades moved up with us. Moved to Bristol about 2 years ago when we were living in a squat round on West Grove. And one of the people from our squat met them, brought them back. And ever since then, we've just been sort of living together, falling over together, having a good laugh generally.
Ridiculed, forgotten, yet subterraneanly robust, Goth is the last remnants of glam in popular culture. Goth is also the youth cult most associated with women and with fiction. This is hardly surprising. As I pointed out before, and is well known, the novel has its origins in Gothic romances, which were predominantly consumed and produced by women, and the complicity of women with the Gothic has been a commonplace of literary criticism at least since Ellen Moers wrote her classic essay, Female Gothic, in 1976. Why think about Goth now? Partly it is because Goth's preposterous, trash aristocratic excess couldn't be more odd, with contemporary culture's hip-hop dominated sportswear brutalitarianism. At the same time, though, Goth's shadow seems unusually visible in pop culture at the moment, what with references to it in both Coronation Street, "You're not even a proper goth," and "Big Brother, what is a Gothic? Can you make me into one?" Partly it is because Rip It Up has revived fascination in all things post-punk, and Goth is the last surviving post-punk cult. These two facts have resulted in IT and me seceding from the oppressive masculinist cool of the club into the more congenial cold of goth haunts. Goth has its own version of more or less every other youth culture, hence there's techno-goth, industrial goth, hippie goth, but let's leave aside the male abjects, the Cramps, the Birthday Party, the Po-Face, the overwrought white dub of Bauhaus, and the Po-Mo, the Sisters of Mercy, who from the start traded in a self-conscious metagoth, and start with Siouxsie. It is well known that the Banshees were formed as a result of the future Siouxsie and Severin meeting at a Roxy show in 1974, which fact was repeated in the really rather bizarre piece on Roxy in last Friday's Guardian, which pursues the postmodern rock critical trend to equate importance with influence far past the point of self-parody, relegating actual discussion of Roxy's output to a paragraph or so before launching into a survey of groups they inspired. So, unlike the Birthday Party, who were famously disgusted when they arrived in London to find it dominated by new romantic poseur pop, the Banshees belonged to an art pop lineage which had a relationship to music which was neither ironically distant nor direct. For all their inventiveness, for all the damage they wreaked upon rock form, the Birthday Party remained romantics, desperate to restore an expressive and expressionistic force to rock, a quest which led them back to the satanic heartland of the blues. If women want to understand what it is like to be the afflicted subject of male sexuality, I wouldn't necessarily advise it. There's no better fast track to What's Inside a Boy than the BP's Zoo Music Girl or Release the Bats. By contrast with this carnal heat, the early Banshees affected a deliberate and deliberated coldness, an artificiality. Siouxsie came from the art rock capital of England, that zone of South London in which both David Bowie, Beckenham, and Japan, Catford, Beckenham, grew up. Although Siouxsie was involved with punk from the very beginning, and although all of the major punk figures, even Sid Vicious, were inspired by Roxy, the Banshees were the first punk group to openly acknowledge a debt to glam. Glam has a special affinity with the English suburbs, its ostentatious anti-conventionality, Negatively inspired by the eccentric conformism of manicured lawns and quietly tended psychosis, Siouxsie sang off on suburban relapse. But glam had been the preserve of male desire. What would its drag look like when worn by a woman? This was a particularly fascinating inversion when we consider that Siouxsie's most significant resource was not the serial identity, sexual ambivalence of Bowie, but the staging of male desire in Roxy music. She may have hung out with Bowie boys, but Siouxsie seemed to borrow much more from the lustrous PVC blackness of For Your Pleasure than from anything in the thin white Duke's wardrobe.
Do you like being classed as a Bowie fan? Yeah, that's what I like, you know. That's what it be. Are you both classed as Bowie fans?
No.
She's not.
I was a Siouxsie fan until I met him.
For Your Pleasure songs like Beauty Queen and Editions of You were self-diagnoses of a male malady, a specular desire that fixates on female objects that it knows can never satisfy it. Although she makes his starry eyes shiver, Ferry knows it never would work out. This is the logic of Lacanian desire, which Alenka Zupančič explains as follows. The interval or gap introduced by desire is always the imaginary other, Lacan's objet petit un, whereas the real other of desire remains unattainable. The real of desire is jouissance, that inhuman partner, as Lacan calls it, that desire aims at beyond its object and that must remain inaccessible. For those, like sea probes, who are skeptical of what an ethics of the drive might look like, I recommend the outstanding essay from which this observation is taken on love as comedy, which is an addendum to The Shortest Shadow. Roxy's In Every Dream House a Heartache is about an attempt, simultaneously disenchanted, cynical, and desire delirious, to resolve this deadlock. It is as if Ferry has recognized, with Lacan, that phallic desire is fundamentally masturbatory, since, that is to say, a phantasmatic screen prevents any sexual relation, so that his desire is always for an inhuman partner. Ferry might as well have a partner that is literally inhuman, a blow-up doll. This scenario has many precursors, most famously perhaps Hoffman's short story The Sandman, one of the main preoccupations of Freud's essay on the uncanny, of course, but also Villiers de L'Isle Adams' lesser-known but actually more chilling masterpiece of decadent SF, The Future Eve, and its descendant, Ira Levin's Stepford Wives. If the traditional problem for the male in pop culture has been dealing with a desire for the unattainable, for Lacan, remember, all desire is a desire for the unattainable, then the complementary difficulty for the female has been to come to terms with not being what the male wants. The object knows that what she has does not correspond with what the subject lacks. It is almost as if the female Goth response to this dilemma is to self-consciously assume the role of the cold, distanced, inhuman partner of phallic desire. Slavoj Žižek, The Metastases of Enjoyment, 1994. The glam male remained trapped in his perfect penthouse populated by dumb, phantasmatic play dolls. The goth female, meanwhile, roams through the roles of vamp and vampire, succubus, automaton. The glam male's pathologies are those of the subject. The goth female's problematic is that of the object. Remember that the original sense of glamour, bewitchment, alludes to the power of the auto-objectified over the subject. If God is masculine, idols are always feminine, Baudrillard writes in Seduction, and Siouxsie differed from previous pop icons in that she was neither a male artist feminized into iconhood by fan adoration, nor a female marionette manipulated by male Svengalis, nor a female heroically struggling to assert a marginalized subjectivity. On the contrary, Siouxsie's perversity was to make an art of her own objectification. As Simon and Joy put it in The Sex Revolts, Siouxsie's aspiration was towards a glacial exteriority of the objet d'art, evinced through a shunning of the moist, pulsing fecundity of organic life. This denial of interiority, unlike Lydia Lunch, Siouxsie is not interested in spilling her guts in a confessional wallowing in the goo and viscera of a damaged interiority, corresponds to a stage refusal to either be a warm, compassionate, understanding fellow creature, Zizek. Like Grace Jones, another who made an art of her own objectification, Siouxsie didn't demand RESPCT from her bachelor suitors, with the implied promise of a healthy relationship based on mutual regard, but subordination, supplication. The goth male is all too ready to comply, although, as Nick Cave's compulsively repetitious career has graphically demonstrated, sniveling prostration may well only be the prelude to homicidal destruction. Groveling in front of the Ice Queen, I kiss the hem of her skirt, the goth male is neither object nor subject, but famously abject. The best image of this idiot lust is the slavering postulant monstrosity on the cover of Birthday Party's Junkyard, and their Release the Bats, a song the group came to despise because they thought it might result in their being pigeonholed as generic goth, remains the most pulsingly compulsive dramatization of the goth abject surrendering himself to the object of his quivering desire. Cave oscillates between worshipping his lady's femme machinic hauteur, my baby is a cool machine, she moves to the pulse of the generator, and pruriently drooling over the filth of her flesh. She doesn't mind a bit of dirt. This conforms almost perfectly with Lacan's description of the courtly lady, whose cold abstraction is not defined by opposition with smelly physicality. Cave's abject is unable to give up on his desire, and the result is well known. In order to continue to desire the woman, he must ensure that he cannot possess her. So that little girl will just have to go. Only when she has made her as cold and unyielding as Fairy's perfect companion, or Poe's parade of beautiful cadavers, can his desire be extended to eternity, because then it is rendered permanently incapable of satisfaction. Instead of asserting an illusory, authentic subjectivity, which supposedly lies beneath the costumes and the cosmetics, Siouxsie and Grace Jones reveled in becoming objects of the gaze. Both would no doubt have appreciated the derision Baudrillard poured upon the strategy of unmasking appearances in Seduction. There is no God behind the images, and the very nothingness they conceal must remain a secret. Siouxsie and Jones, embracing of their objectality, testifies to the fact that there is a scopic drive that cult studs whining about being reduced to an object has always ignored. The exhibitionist drive to be seen. Simon is right that Painted Bird, from the Banshees' mistress piece, A Kiss in the Dream House, and the nearly contemporary Fireworks were virtual manifestos for goth. But it's worth reflecting on how different these songs are in message and mood from the hackneyed image of the culture. Both Painted Bird and Fireworks, with its exultant image of self-beautification, as a glam gesture flashing amid the murk of mundanity, are not maudlin, matte black, or self-absorbed, but celebrations of the colourful and the collective. We are fireworks, Siouxsie sings, burning shapes into the night. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a song that crackles with so much enjoyment as this. The Banshees' take on Kosiński's novel Painted Bird is also about the triumph of collective joy over persecuted, isolated, individuated subjectivity. In Kosiński's novel, the hero paints one bird, and when he throws it back to its flock, they don't recognize it, and therefore destroy it. But Siouxsie's goths are not painted by another's hand. They are painted birds by their own design. It is not the familiar tragic, heroic scenario in which an outsider, destined to lose, nevertheless makes a solitary stand against the conformist herd. The dowdy flock are to be confounded, but by another flock, not by an individual, and the result is not frustration, but again, jouissance. By the end of the song, there's no more sorrow. Think how different this is to the confederacy of isolation produced by Joy Division. See Fisher's Nihil Rebound, Joy Division, on K-Punk, whose functional clothes and non-image imply the traditional male subjectivist privileging of the inside over the outside, depth over surface. Here was one type of black hole, the line of abolition Deleuze Guattari describe in Micropolitics and Segmentarity, the drive towards self-destruction. Thousand Plateaus. The Banshees, on the other hand, were more like the cold stars invoked by Neubauten, forbidding, remote, yet also the queens of a paradoxically egalitarian aristocracy, in which membership was not guaranteed by birth or beauty, but by self-decoration. Siouxsie's hyper-white pan-stick radiated the cold light of stardom Baudrillard evokes in Seduction. Stars are dazzling in their nullity and in their coldness, the coldness of makeup and ritual hieratism. Rituals are cool, according to McLuhan. Baudrillard, Seduction. The sterility of idols is well known, Baudrillard continues. They do not reproduce, but arise from the ashes, like the phoenix, or from the mirror, like the seductress. The Gothic has always been about replication, as opposed to reproduction. See Fisher, Let Me Tell You About My Mother in Flatline Constructs. It's no coincidence that the female vampire was often associated with lesbianism, most gloriously in what is perhaps the definitive goth film, The Hunger, because vampires and lesbians, like machines, present the horror, from the point of view of the phallic one, of a propagative power that has no use for the male seed. Conversely, female Gothic often pathologizes pregnancy, utilizing the language of horror to describe the gradual takeover of the body by an entity that is both appallingly familiar and impossibly alien. We Hunger, from the Banshees' hyena, with its horror of suckling, fits into a lineage of female horror which has seen pregnancy in terms of the appalling rapacity of the insect world as a parasitic infestation. Simon Reynolds and Joy Press, The Sex Revolts. The principal goth vectors of propagation are, of course, signs and clothes as signs. The Siouxsie look is, in effect, a replicatable cosmetic mask, a literal effacement of the organic expressivity of the face by a geometric pattern, all hard angles and harsh contrasts between white and black. White tribalism. In Rip It Up, Simon says that the early Banshees were sexy in the way that Ballard's Crash was sexy, and Ballard's abstract fiction theory is as palpable and vast a presence in the Banshees as it is in other post-punk. It's telling that the turn from the angular dryness of the Banshees' early sound to the humid lushness of their later phase should have been legitimated by Severin's reading of The Unlimited Dream Company. But what the Banshees drew out from Ballard was the equivalence of the semiotic, the psychotic, the erotic, and the savage. With psychoanalysis, and Ballard is nothing if not a committed reader of Freud, Ballard recognized that there is no biological sexuality waiting beneath the alienated layers of civilization. Ballard's compulsively repeated theme of reversion to savagery does not represent a return to a non-symbolized bucolic nature, but a fallback into an intensely semioticized and ritualized symbolic space. It is only the postmoderns who believe in a pre-symbolic nature. Eroticism is made possible, not merely mediated, by signs and technical apparatus, such that the body, signs and machines become interchangeable. Baudrillard understood this very well in his post-punk era essay on Crash. Quote, "Each mark, each trace, each scar left on the body is like an artificial invagination, like the scarifications of savages. Only the wounded body exists symbolically, for itself and for others. Sexual desire is never anything but the possibility bodies have of combining and exchanging their signs. Now, the few natural orifices to which one normally attaches sex and sexual activities are nothing next to all the possible wounds, all the artificial orifices. But why artificial? All the breaches through which the body is reversibilized and, like certain topological spaces, no longer knows either interior or interior. Sex is largely overtaken by the fan of symbolic wounds, which are in some sense the anagrammatization of the whole length of the body. But now, precisely, It is no longer sex, but something else. The savages knew how to use the whole body to this end, in tattooing, torture, initiation. Sexuality was only one of the possible metaphors of symbolic exchange, neither the most significant nor the most prestigious, as it has become for us in its obsessional and realistic reference, thanks to its organic and functional character, including in orgasm. End quote. Baudrillard, Simulacra and Simulation, 1981. As is well known, female disease in capitalism is often expressed not in an assertion of the natural against the artificial, but in the inorganic protest of eating disorders and self-cutting. See Nina Power, Cutters, Infinite Thought, 2005. It's hard not to see this, as IT, following Zizek, does, as part of the obsession with realistic reference, an attempt to strip away all signs and rituals so as to reach the unadored thing in itself. Goth is in many ways an attempt to make good this symbolic deficit in postmodern culture, dressing up as re-ritualization, a recovery of the surface of the body as the site for scarification and decoration, which is to say, a rejection of the idea that the body is merely the container or envelope for interiority. Take Goth footwear, with their flagrant, anti-organic angularity, their disdain for the utilitarian criteria of comfort or functionality. Goth shoes and boots bend, bind, twist, and extend the body. Clothing recovers its cybernetic and symbolic role as a hyperbolic supplement to the body, as that which destroys the illusion of organic unity and proportion.